The ballroom was a sea of shimmering dresses and dark, expensive suits, all moving under the soft, out-of-focus glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers. The air hummed with a particular kind of energy, not the joyful buzz of a celebration, but the calculated thrum of a networking event. This was a place for connections, for quiet handshakes that sealed million-dollar deals, for smiles that were more like strategic weapons than expressions of happiness. And in the middle of it all, sitting at a table so close to the stage it was almost a display of dominance, was a man who seemed immune to it all. He wasn't just part of the scene. He was its cold, silent center. His name was Robert, and to the world he was a success story carved from granite. He was the CEO of a tech empire that had changed how people lived their lives. A man who started with nothing and built an empire on sheer will and an unnerving ability to see the world as a series of problems to be solved. He wore his power like the tailored suit he had on, a perfect, stiff, and utterly impenetrable shell. The collar was tight, the fabric unforgiving, but he never seemed to notice. It was his armor. He sat with his back perfectly straight, a glass of something amber and expensive in his hand, but he hadn't taken a sip in over 20 minutes. His eyes, a cool, sharp gray, weren't focused on the speaker at the podium, who was droning on about the charity's wonderful work. Instead, Robert's gaze swept the room, cataloging, analyzing. He saw the couples who were really just business alliances, the eager young entrepreneurs trying to catch his eye, the old money looking down on the new. He saw it all not as a community of people, but as a complex system of inputs and outputs, assets and liabilities. A man at his table, a junior partner from his firm, leaned in. "Incredible turnout, sir. The PR from this alone will be worth the donation." Robert gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't look at the man. "It's a transaction, David. We provide the funds. They provide the optics. Ensure the photographer gets a good shot of the check." His voice was low and level, devoid of any warmth. It was the voice he used in boardrooms, a voice that brokered no argument and invited no conversation. David, who had hoped for a moment of camaraderie, quickly retreated, turning his attention back to the stage. Robert didn't notice his discomfort. He was already back to scanning the room, his mind a million miles away, running through spreadsheets and projections that were invisible to everyone else. This gala, this whole evening, was an obligation, a line item on a calendar. A necessary, but tedious, part of the machinery. He thought, not for the first time, how much he despised these events. They were inefficient. They were filled with noise and false emotion. He preferred the clean, logical world of code, of market trends, of numbers that didn't lie. People lied. Their smiles lied, their laughter lied, their promises lied. He had learned that lesson a long time ago, and it was a lesson that had cost him dearly. The memory was like a small, sharp stone in his shoe, one he had learned to ignore so well he sometimes forgot it was there. He'd built a whole life around that stone, constructing a foundation so strong that nothing could ever touch him again. No surprise, no joy, and certainly no pain. He picked up his phone from the pristine white tablecloth, the screen lighting up his face with a cool, blue glow. He swiped through his emails, his thumb moving with practiced efficiency. A merger proposal, a threat from a competitor, a quarterly report that was almost perfect. He fired off quick, decisive replies, each word chosen for maximum impact and minimum emotion. This was his world. This was what he controlled. The chaos of the ballroom faded into a dull, irrelevant roar. The speaker on stage finally finished, and the room erupted in polite, practiced applause. Robert didn't even look up. He was already calculating how much longer he needed to stay. Another 30 minutes, perhaps. Just long enough to be seen, to nod at the right people, and then he could escape to the quiet of his car and the silence of his penthouse apartment. And now, a new voice boomed through the speakers, the moment we've all been waiting for. A special performance from the students of the city's youth music program. Robert felt a familiar wave of irritation wash over him. This was the worst part of these galas. The obligatory cute factor. He pictured a group of off-key children fumbling through some simple song, their parents beaming in the audience as if they were witnessing Carnegie Hall. It was a waste of his time. He could be closing a deal in Asia right now, a deal that would create thousands of jobs and generate billions in revenue. Instead, he was forced to sit through. He took a sip of his drink. The whiskey was warm and flat, the ice having melted long ago. It tasted like obligation. He put the glass down with a soft click, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He remembered once, years ago, being forced to attend his niece's school play. She had forgotten all her lines and stood on stage, crying, while the audience offered awkward, sympathetic applause. He remembered feeling nothing but a profound sense of annoyance at the wasted evening. He expected this to be more of the same. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, causing a hush to fall over the crowd. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand piano centered on the stage. Robert sighed, a quiet breath of air that no one else could hear. He let his mind drift back to the problems waiting for him at the office, building a mental wall against the saccharine performance he was about to endure. He was a fortress, and tonight was just another storm to weather, another insignificant event to be filed away and forgotten. He had no idea that the walls he had spent decades building were about to be shaken to their very foundation by the small hands of a little girl he had never met. The polite applause that followed the MC's announcement was thin and scattered, like rain on a hot pavement. It was the kind of clapping people do out of obligation, a quick patter of hands before they return to their own worlds. The spotlight on the grand piano felt like an island in a sea of shadows, and for a moment nothing happened. The MC's smile faltered for a second, a professional crack in the glossy facade. Then, from the side of the stage, a small figure emerged. She was so tiny that she seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the stage itself. The spotlight hit her, and she flinched, raising a small hand to shield her eyes. It was a gesture so honest, so unguarded, that a few people in the audience let out soft, affectionate laughs. But Robert wasn't among them. He watched her with the cold patience of a predator, waiting for the inevitable fumbling. He saw a simple, light blue dress, a bit too big for her small frame, with a white ribbon tied at the waist that was slightly crooked. Her shoes, as he'd noted from a distance, were indeed scuffed, the black patent leather cracked at the toes as if from many days of running and playing. To him, it was a picture of unpreparedness, a lack of seriousness that grated on his meticulously ordered sense of the world. The little girl, whose name he had already forgotten, walked toward the piano with hesitant steps, as if the floor were made of glass. She wasn't gliding or prancing like the child performers who had come before her. She was just, walking, one foot in front of the other, her focus entirely on the bench waiting for her. She carried a single piece of paper, held carefully in both hands like a treasure. Robert watched her, his mind already categorizing her, amateur, under-rehearsed, a distraction. He picked up his phone again, the cool glass of familiar comfort in his hand. He could at least clear out his inbox while this was happening. It was a more productive use of his time, but then he paused. The girl had reached the piano, and the real challenge began. The bench was a polished, monolithic thing designed for an adult. She tried to climb onto it, her small legs struggling. She had to place the sheet music carefully on the floor, then use both hands to hoist herself up, her little shoes scrambling for a purchase. It was an awkward, clumsy process. A few more titters from the audience. Robert felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't amusement. It was closer to annoyance. Why hadn't an adult helped her? Why was this part of the show? It felt undignified. Once she was finally seated, her feet dangled high above the polished gold pedals, swinging gently like pendulums. She leaned forward, her whole body straining to pick up the sheet music from the floor. She placed it on the stand, and Robert could see it now. It wasn't a crisp new printout. It was old, the paper yellowed at the edges. There were creases, as if it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. In the margins, he could just make out small, handwritten pencil marks, little reminders and corrections written in a child's loopy script. There was even a faint circular stain near the top corner, the ghost of a glass that had once sat on it. This wasn't just music. It was a map of a journey. The girl, whose name was Maya, took a deep breath. It was a visible, full-body breath. Her small shoulders rose and fell. She looked out at the dark room, at the hundreds of shadowy faces, and for a second she seemed to freeze. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined. The room was quiet now, the polite chatter having died down. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, full of expectation. Robert found himself holding his own breath, a strange, involuntary reaction. He told himself it was just tension. The hope that this would be over quickly. Maya's small hands finally moved from her lap and found the keys. They were pale against the white and black ivory, her fingers short and unpolished. There were no rings, no fancy nail polish, just the clean, simple hands of a child. She hovered them over the keys for a moment, as if feeling for the right place, the right energy. Then her fingers descended. The first note that rang out was not loud or showy. It was clear and soft, a single, pure sound that seemed to absorb all the noise in the room. It was so simple, so clean, that it felt out of place in the ornate ballroom. It was a sound that belonged in a quiet living room on a sunny afternoon. Robert's thumb, which had been poised to scroll on his phone, stopped moving. He didn't look down, but his focus had shifted entirely from the screen to the sound. Another note followed, and then another. It wasn't a song he recognized, not a famous classical piece or a popular tune. It was a simple melody built from basic chords that a beginner would learn. But there was something in the way she played it. It wasn't technically perfect. There was a slight hesitation between two of the notes, a timing that a computer would have corrected. But that hesitation gave the melody a human heartbeat. It was the sound of feeling, of thought, of a story being told. The quiet in the ballroom deepened. The clinking of ice and glasses had stopped. The rustle of programs had ceased. One by one, people who had been whispering to their neighbors fell silent. They turned their heads, their bodies leaning forward slightly, as if being pulled toward the stage by an invisible string. The music was not demanding their attention. It was earning it. It was a quiet, gentle force that was steadily taking over the room. Robert finally lowered his phone, placing it face down on the white tablecloth. The glow of the stock market, the emails, the endless stream of data that constituted his world was gone. All he could see was the small girl under the spotlight, her body swaying almost imperceptibly as she played. And all he could hear was that simple, haunting melody. It was like a voice he hadn't heard in a very long time, a memory trying to surface from a deep, dark ocean. He didn't know what it was yet, but he felt a shift inside him, a subtle loosening of a knot he hadn't even known was there. The fortress was still standing, but a single, clear note had just slipped through a crack in the wall. The melody hung in the air, simple and clear, like a single drop of water in a silent cave. For Robert, the world began to change shape. The glittering chandeliers above him seemed to soften, their sharp, crystal edges blurring into fuzzy halos of light. The faces of the people at the surrounding tables, which he had been scanning and cataloging just moments before, melted into an indistinct, shadowy audience. The only things that remained in sharp focus were the grand piano on the stage and the little girl swaying with the music. The sound was a key, and it was turning a lock deep inside him that he hadn't touched in 30 years. At first, his mind, a machine built on logic and reason, tried to fight it. It was just a coincidence, a common chord progression. Thousands of songs probably sounded like this. He tried to re-engage his defenses, to rebuild the wall that had been so effortlessly breached. He thought about the quarterly reports, the pending merger, the 5-year strategic plan. He tried to force the numbers back into his head, to replace the feeling with facts. But the music was persistent. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was gentle, insistent, like a hand softly tapping on a door you've long forgotten. Then the first image broke through. It wasn't a full scene, just a fragment. A splash of afternoon. Sunlight falling across a worn wooden floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden stars. The smell hit him next, a phantom scent so real he almost turned his head. It was the smell of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet aroma of his mother baking an apple pie in the next room. It was the smell of his childhood home, a place he had deliberately erased from his mental map. He was no longer in a ballroom filled with strangers in expensive clothes. He was sitting on the floor of a small, cozy living room, his back against the leg of a sofa covered in a slightly scratchy wool blanket. The world of the gala was gone, replaced by a memory so vivid it felt more real than reality. He could feel the nap of the old, faded carpet under his fingertips. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. And in front of him, dominating the small room, was their old, upright piano. It wasn't grand or shiny like the one on stage. It was a battleship of dark wood, its surface scarred with the nicks and scratches of a family's life. A coffee mug ring stained the wood right next to the sheet music stand, and then she was there. His sister Clara sat on the piano bench. She was even smaller than the girl on the stage, her thin frame swallowed by a bulky, hand-knitted sweater. Her hair was the color of pale honey, pulled back in a loose braid that was already coming undone. She was frail, her skin almost translucent. But when she played the piano, she was the strongest person he had ever known. Her hands, though small, moved with a confidence and purpose that seemed to belong to someone else. She wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was telling a story. Robert watched the intense focus on her face, the way her lower lip was caught between her teeth in concentration. He saw the same melody being played, note for note. It was her song, the one she was trying to perfect. She had found it in an old, tattered book of folk tunes their grandmother had given them. It was a simple melody, but she said it felt like it had a sad heart and a hopeful smile all at once. She played it every single day. Sometimes her fingers would fumble and a sour note would clang out, making her wince. But she would just take a deep breath, square her small shoulders, and start again. He remembered watching her, feeling a strange mix of admiration and impatience. He was a teenager then, full of restless energy and big dreams that stretched far beyond the confines of their small town. He saw the piano as her world, a small, safe world, while his was out there, waiting to be conquered. He loved her, but he didn't understand her. He didn't understand how she could find so much joy in a simple melody, so much peace in a dusty living room. While he was chafing at the bit to leave, the memory shifted, the scene dissolving and reforming like a cloud. Now he was standing by the front door, a heavy suitcase at his feet. It was the day he was leaving for college. The whole family was there. His mother was crying quietly, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. His father was clapping him on the back, his gruff pride barely masking his sadness. And Clara was standing by the piano, her hands resting on the keys. "You'll come back to hear me play it, right?" she had asked, her voice quiet but firm. "When I get it perfect, you'll have to come back and hear it." He remembered laughing, a carefree, confident sound that felt alien to him now. "Of course I will squirt," he had said, ruffling her hair. "As soon as you master that thing, I'll be front and center. I'll even bring you a fancy new music book." It was a promise made lightly, a throwaway line from a young man who thought he had all the time in the world. He saw the look on her face then, a look of pure, unwavering belief. She believed him. She held that promise close, like a precious stone, back in the ballroom. A single tear escaped Robert's eye and traced a hot, unfamiliar path down his cold cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He was no longer aware of the velvet tablecloth, the crystal glass, or the hundreds of people around him. He was standing in his old hallway, looking at his sister's hopeful face, and the sound of her imperfect, beautiful melody was filling his ears, played by the hands of a little girl he'd never met. The weight of that casual, broken promise began to press down on him, a heavy, crushing force that threatened to shatter the man he had become. The fortress was not just cracking. The entire foundation was beginning to crumble. The memory of his sister's hopeful face was like a lit match thrown into a room filled with gasoline. The promise he had made so casually, "I'll be back to hear you play it," echoed in his mind. But now it was followed by a silence, a vast, terrible silence that had been growing for 30 years. The little girl on the stage, Maya, continued to play, and each note was a hammer blow against the dam he had built around his heart. He remembered his first few months at college. The world had exploded with color and noise. There were new people, new ideas, a future that shimmered with possibility. He called home, of course, but the calls became shorter, more infrequent. He'd ask about his parents, about the dog, and then, almost as an afterthought, he'd ask, "How's Clara?" His mother's voice would always tighten just a little. "She's having a good day," she would say, or "she's tired today." He never pressed for more details. He didn't want to know. He was building a new life, one that didn't include the shadow of his sister's illness. He remembered the first time he came home for a break. He walked in, full of stories about his classes and his new friends, and he saw her. She was thinner, her skin paler than he remembered. She was wrapped in a blanket on the sofa, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "You're back," she whispered. He had hugged her, feeling the fragility of her bones, and a wave of guilt had washed over him so strongly he had to pull away. "Hey, Squirt," he had said, his voice too loud, too cheerful. "Heard you're still torturing that piano." She had smiled weakly. "I'm getting better. Almost perfect." He had nodded, already thinking about the party he was meeting his friends at that night. He never went to the piano to listen. He couldn't. The music in the ballroom swelled slightly, a gentle rise in the melody that felt like a question. Robert's hands, which had been resting on the table, clenched into fists. His knuckles were white. The memories were coming faster now, a torrent of moments he had suppressed. He remembered a phone call in the middle of the night during his sophomore year. It was his father. "It's not good, son," he had said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You should come home." Robert had a major economics exam the next morning, one that counted for 40% of his grade. "Dad, I can't," he had pleaded. "Not right now. This exam it's everything." "How about next weekend?" "I'll come home next weekend, I promise." His father had sighed, a sound heavy with disappointment and grief, and had agreed. Next weekend? But by the time next weekend came, there was a new crisis, a new reason to stay. A job interview for a prestigious summer internship. Another promise broken. He saw it all now, a chain of excuses, a path of avoidance paved with good intentions. He wasn't a bad person, he told himself. He was just busy. He was building a future for himself, for them he had rationalized. He would make enough money to get the best doctors, to buy her anything she wanted. It was a lie, he told himself, to quiet the gnawing guilt. He was running. He was running from the sight of her fading, from the helplessness he felt, from the fact that he couldn't fix it. So he threw himself into his work, into the world of logic and numbers where problems had solutions. The melody on the stage became more somber, the notes falling like soft, persistent rain. And then came the final, most brutal memory. He was in a sleek, modern conference room in his first real job. He was 22 years old, wearing a suit that was still a little stiff, presenting a marketing strategy to a room full of senior executives. He was nervous, but he was also electric with ambition. This was his chance. His phone, which he had foolishly forgotten to silence, buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He saw an older executive frown at him. He discreetly pulled the phone out and glanced at the screen under the table. It was his mother. He silenced it, his heart pounding with a mix of annoyance and a flicker of dread. He would call her back after the presentation. He had to nail this. He did nail it. They loved his ideas. He walked out of that room feeling 10 feet tall, his future laid out before him. He found a quiet corner in the hallway, finally able to breathe, and pulled out his phone to call his mother back. He had 3 missed calls. He listened to the voicemail, his mother's voice, shaky and strange. "Robert, call me. It's Clara." He felt a cold dread wash over him. He called back. His father answered. His father, the man who never cried, was sobbing. "She's gone, son," he choked out. "She passed away this morning. She was asking for you." Robert remembered leaning his head against the cool plaster wall of the hallway. He remembered the sounds of the office, the ringing phones, the people laughing, the world going on as if nothing had happened. And he remembered the first clear, conscious thought that entered his mind. Asterisk, I can't fall apart now. I have a career to build. Asterisk. He had thanked his father, said some hollow words, hung up the phone, and walked back to his desk. He didn't go to the funeral. He couldn't get the time off work, he told himself. He sent flowers. He wrote a check. He compartmentalized the grief, shoving it into a deep, dark corner of his soul, promising himself he would deal with it later. And now, 30 years later, had finally arrived. The little girl on the stage played the final chord of the song. It was a single, resonant note that hung in the air, pure and heartbreaking. It was the sound of an ending. It was the sound of a promise left unfulfilled. It was the sound of his sister's last breath, and the dam broke. It wasn't a single tear this time. It was a guttural animal sound that tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. His shoulders began to shake violently, and he doubled over as if he had been punched in the stomach. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful CEO shattered into a million pieces. He was no longer a man of steel. He was a boy who had lost his sister, a man who had run away from his pain for 3 decades, and it had finally caught up to him. The sobs ripped through him, huge, racking convulsions that stole his breath. He couldn't stop them. He didn't want to stop them. Years of unshed tears, of swallowed grief, of quiet regret, all came pouring out of him in a torrent. He put his face in his hands, his body trembling uncontrollably. The expensive suit felt like a costume, the ballroom a prison. He was completely undone. The room, which had been spellbound by the music, was now in a state of shocked confusion. The little girl on stage took a small bow, her face innocent and unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. The applause began, hesitant at first, then growing into a thunderous ovation for her beautiful performance. But Robert didn't hear it. He was lost in his own world of sound and fury, a world of broken promises and a silence that was finally screaming, "David!" His junior partner stared at him, his face a mask of horror and bewilderment. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, reaching out a tentative hand. Robert flinched away from his touch, shaking his head, unable to speak. The people at the nearby tables were staring, whispering. They saw the titan of industry, the cold, unfeeling CEO, sobbing like a child at a charity gala. They didn't understand. They couldn't. They only saw the breakdown, not the reason for it. He was a spectacle, a public embarrassment. But for the first time in his life, Robert didn't care about appearances. He didn't care about what anyone thought. He was just a man drowning in a sea of regret, and the little girl's piano music had been the first drop of rain in a storm that had been brewing for a lifetime. The thunderous applause that filled the ballroom was a physical thing, a wall of sound that crashed over Robert, but he couldn't hear it. He was in a vacuum, a world of his own making, filled with the echoes of a single, haunting melody and the sound of his own ragged breathing. His body was still convulsing with sobs, each one a violent release of 30 years of pent-up grief. The expensive suit was damp and wrinkled, his face a mess of tears and snot, a portrait of complete and utter unraveling. The man of steel was rust, crumbling away to nothing. David, his junior partner, was still hovering, his face a mixture of pity and professional panic. "Sir, Robert, maybe we should get you some air?" he stammered, his hand hovering uncertainly over Robert's shoulder. He was looking around, his eyes wide with embarrassment, trying to gauge who was watching. To David, this was a catastrophe, a PR nightmare. The unflappable leader of their company, a public wreck. Robert heard the words through a thick fog. Air, yes, air. He couldn't breathe in this room. The air was stale, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and feigned concern. He pushed himself up from the table, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He knocked over his untouched glass of whiskey, the amber liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like a dark, ugly stain. He didn't look at it. He didn't look at David. He just started walking. He moved like a man in a trance, pushing his way through the crowd. People parted for him, their faces a blur of shock and curiosity. They saw the tear-streaked face, the disheveled suit, the raw, open wound of a man who had lost all control. They whispered behind their hands, but their words were just more noise, more meaningless sound that couldn't penetrate his bubble of pain. He had only one destination, the exit. He had to get out. As he neared the edge of the room, he saw her. The little girl, Maya, was standing near the stage with her parents. Her father had a protective arm around her, and her mother was wiping a smudge of something from her cheek. She looked small and tired, but her eyes were bright with the lingering excitement of her performance. She was the eye of the storm, the quiet center of all this chaos. Robert stopped. His feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. He knew he should just keep walking to escape the stares and the whispers. But a deeper instinct, one he hadn't listened to in decades, told him he had to talk to her. He walked towards her, his gait unsteady. Her parents saw him coming, and their expressions changed from pride to a kind of wary confusion. They recognized him, of course. His face was on the cover of business magazines. They saw the powerful CEO, the billionaire, approaching their small daughter, and they didn't know what to do. Robert stopped a few feet away from them. He ignored the parents, his focus entirely on the little girl. He knelt down, his expensive trousers creasing on the floor, until he was at her eye level. It was a gesture of such complete humility that it silenced the whispers around them. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat was thick with emotion. He just looked at her innocent, questioning eyes. He saw his sister in those eyes. He saw the hope and the purity he had spent a lifetime running from. Finally, he managed to choke out a single word. "Thank you." His voice was a raw, broken thing, a stranger's voice. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her about his sister, about the promise, about the years of silence. He wanted to explain that she hadn't just played a song. She had unlocked a door to a room he had boarded up a lifetime ago. But he couldn't. The words were too big, too heavy. Maya just looked at him, her head tilted to one side. She didn't see a powerful CEO or a crying man. She just saw a person who was sad. She gave him a small, shy smile, a simple, human gesture of kindness that was more powerful than any boardroom applause. "You're welcome," she whispered. Robert nodded, a single, jerky motion. He pushed himself to his feet, gave the parents a look that was both an apology and a dismissal. And then he turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in a cloud of confusion and wonder. He burst through the heavy doors of the ballroom and out into the cool night air. It was a shock to his system, like a splash of cold water on his face. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the city air. It smelled of exhaust fumes and damp pavement, and it was the most real thing he had ever smelled. He was standing on a grand terrace overlooking the glittering city skyline, but he wasn't looking at the view. He was looking down at his own trembling hands. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was a portal back to his old life, a life of emails and stock prices and strategic acquisitions. He swiped past the notifications, past the urgent messages from his office, his thumb moving with a new and desperate purpose. He scrolled through his contacts, past the names of investors and politicians and rivals, until he found the one he was looking for. It was just listed as home. He hadn't called it in years. He stared at the name, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the point of no return. He could still turn back. He could go back inside, smooth things over, blame his breakdown on exhaustion or a bad clam. He could go back to his penthouse, pour himself a drink, and bury the pain all over again. But he couldn't. The music had changed something fundamental inside him. The dam wasn't just broken. It was washed away. There was nothing left to hide behind. He pressed the screen. The phone began to ring. Each ring was an eternity, a drumbeat counting down the last moments of his old life. He expected it to go to voicemail. He hoped it would. He wasn't ready for this. But then someone answered. A small, hesitant voice, fragile with age and surprise. "Hello?" Robert closed his eyes. It was his mother's voice. It sounded older, thinner than he remembered, but it was hers. It was the sound of home. He opened his mouth, and for a second he thought he wouldn't be able to speak. But then the words came, carried on a wave of tears and relief. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, could feel her shock and confusion across the miles. "Robert?" She finally said his name, a question, a prayer, a ghost from the past. I'm so sorry, he sobbed, the words tumbling out of him, a torrent of regret. I'm so sorry for everything. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He heard a soft gasp, and then he could hear her crying, too. It wasn't a sad sound. It was a sound of release, of a wound that had finally been opened so it could begin to heal. They didn't say anything else for a long time. They just cried together, a mother and a son separated by 30 years of silence, connected by a phone line and a little girl's song. Finally, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his breath still coming in ragged gasps. He looked out at the city lights, no longer seeing them as a kingdom he had built, but as a place he had been lost in. I'm coming home, Mom, he said, his voice clear and firm for the first time all night. I'm coming home. He didn't wait for a reply. He just ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't call his driver. He didn't arrange for a car. He just started walking. He walked down the grand steps of the hotel and onto the sidewalk. A man in a tuxedo with no destination in mind other than the one in his heart. He walked into the night, leaving the CEO behind, becoming just a man, a brother, a son, finally on his way home.